Thank you for tuning into this week's podcast of John Aloud. This week we got JP Wilson here to talk about Is America a Christian Nation? For those who don't know who JP Wilson is the head pastor of Summit Church. He has a bachelor's in theology and has a couple projects going on. One is Operation Serve Kids, which is going to be serving underprivileged kids in the area. Also, they're looking at remodeling their Moldova orphanage, which is a safe house for sex trafficking. Also, they're looking at starting a new operation coming up in the future, which is possibly going to be building a homeless shelter for the area. In this podcast, we're taking a look at the question, is America a Christian nation? We explore some of the history of America and God's journey along with America and America today in its current state, and how Christians were then and how Christians are now. If you do enjoy this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and like us on the socials. Thank you. JP, how you doing today?
Hey, doing well. Good to hear from you. You doing good?
Oh yeah, always doing good. So, as you know, we're talking about is America a Christian nation today? And one thing that I think is kind of funny, at least I've noticed a trend of it. A lot of Americans have a visual of Jesus in their mind as, a white, light brown hair, blue-eyed Jesus Christ. While it is kind of insignificant, the idea of what color skin he had, it can be used as a, let's say, a way for people who don't exactly have Jesus Christ's ideals or message in mind to be used kind of maliciously. Have you noticed that trend, or what is the best way, I guess? Which way is it? What's that often? Is that a bad thing that's in their mind of Jesus?
Well, I really believe that the color of Jesus' skin is totally irrelevant. I could care less personally, and I think others would say the same. What color his skin is, I probably would care more what color your shoes are right now than I would care what color his his skin was, because it's not his message is what is the most important part, right? It's not your skin, because it's not the outward appearance anyway. In fact, it's interesting that even Jesus's human form wasn't anything attractive, the Bible says. In fact, when they went to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, there was nothing ordinary or extraordinary to say about Jesus. He was a very ordinary man. In fact, they had to ask Judas to point him out to him, because he wasn't a guy that stood out. He was just a normal guy, just like everybody else, just a normal, average-looking person. And he could have been black, he could have been white, he could have been pink, for all we care. It was the message that he brought that I think is so powerful.
And I think the whole, I guess, race of Jesus Christ, only reason why it's even a topic today is because of how hot of a topic race is in at least America currently. And so that kind of brings up like two different types of Christianity: American Christianity, and then of course Christianity itself. Of course, there's different divisions of Christianity, different like Lutheran, Catholic, non-denominational, you can list all of them. But for some reason, it seems more often than not, this topic of at least race with Jesus seems to be more of an American topic of things. Do we I think I have a definition of what American Christianity is. It's become more and more of a talking point recently. How would you necessarily define American Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. American Christianity, well, obviously, just the words itself define it: Christianity with American slant, and that's not always a good thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either. I think just Christianity by itself, without putting a prefix on it, American, Indian, or Chinese, or what, is irrelevant. I think It's just the Christianity is the study and the belief of Christ. And so many times, it's interesting. We try to believe something through our our limbs of our society that we live in, and it's very ineffective. I remember reading a story about Hudson Taylor, who was one of the first missionaries to China years ago, and he went there, and he went with this thought that he needed to share Jesus with them. Obviously, that was his desire, but
Mm-hmm.
with it, he also couldn't help but share, his. I mean, he didn't. He wore European clothes. They wore robes. He had a European haircut. They had, a long black, piece of hair, shaved head with a long piece of hair down their back, and they ate different foods than he ate. And he wondered after several years of being there why he was so ineffective. And it dawned on him, I think through prayer, that, Paul said, I've become all things to all men, that I may win some. And so he said, well, you know what? If it worked for Paul, it'll work for me. So he shaved his head, started growing a long ponytail, or what did he call that? And
Mm-hmm.
started wearing robes, and started eating the food that they ate. And to his surprise, people started listening to what he had to say, started coming to Christ by the droves, and he became a very powerful and apostle in the land of China. And it all happened because he tried to stick to the gospel and not try to make it about the culture he was from or society he was from, and because Christianity is the only thing that is cross-cultural.
Yeah.
Every other thing that we have typically is it can't be cross-cultural, but Christianity, it seems to know no boundaries. There's no boundaries for Christianity. It works, and it's powerful no matter what culture it's in.
I do like that stating that Christianity is cross-cultural, because it definitely works in America to some degree, at least. There's definitely arguments that the Christian church in America has gotten a little complacent. But I think that mostly comes from, I want to say that the American church is kind of split between two different, I guess, beliefs. And that may come, this is where American Christianity is separating here. So you have your conservative crowd that call themselves conservative Christians, whether they're, Catholic, Lutheran, Presbyterian, whatever. They prefer the title conservative Christian. And then you also have your progressive Christians who prefer the title progressive Christian rather than Catholic, Lutheran, Presbyterian, whatever. And I seem to have a problem. I don't know what it is. Deep down, I have a problem with the term conservative Christian or progressive Christian or liberal, whatever you want to call it. Something doesn't sit right with me with those. And I haven't been able to fully flush it out exactly what it is. I think it's the preface of, like, you're prefacing Christianity to conservatism or prefacing Christianity to progressiveness. Like, Christianity has to go through the conservative filter first, or Christianity has to go through the progressive filter first. And I think that comes just from calling America a Christian nation, just subtly. Now, I'm not saying that America can't be a Christian nation, or the term itself is bad, but I think it hasn't been talked in depth enough of what that means. So we can go back to, I guess, what makes America a Christian nation to begin with.
Yeah. Well, if you study the history of America through the lens of God being part of the story, you'll find a very different narrative than you'll find in most public school history books.
Mm-hmm.
There was a great book written by Peter Marshall called The Light and the Glory. Recommend everybody listen to read that. He had another sequel to it wasn't quite as good, but very powerful as well, called From Sea to Shining Sea. And it's a very, he does a great work. There's other works as well that really begin to dive into what made America the America that we know it today. So some would argue that there's been no other nation in the history of the world so supernaturally formed than outside of Israel than America. And if you'll read some of these articles, books, and findings of history where God is allowed to be part of the narrative, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Columbus, for example. Columbus is, in this time in our history, is being vilified. And there's people, saying we shouldn't celebrate him at all. And obviously, but before we even go into any of that, you have to understand, all people have flaws, right? I mean, you don't have history if you don't have flawed people. There's no such thing as perfect history when perfect people making history. Every person that we talk about as heroes or people that we should admire or look up to, they had their flaws. Columbus perhaps had some flaws. We know later on he definitely became greedy and allowed pride to go to his head. But in the early days, he felt he was under a mandate to find a new world for the propagation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He had a dream. He writes in one of his books, he had a dream, and it was a people that had never been, type of people that had never been seen. And he was sent to these people to share the gospel with them. And so that was why he was so driven and passionate. That was the drive behind him, having to find boats, having to find a crew, having to make this sail across the ocean to, a distance that no one had ever gone to. And so he's under this mandate because he had this vision from God, and he gets further than anybody ever crossed in the Atlantic, and his men are now very worried. They're about to commit mutiny. They've talked amongst themselves. Columbus gets wind of it. He stands in front of all of his crew. He says, listen, I know you're fearful. I know you're thinking to yourself, if we even turn around now, we still don't have enough food to get back. We've gone so far. I know you're fearful of the fact that no one's gone this far and you don't know what's ahead. I get it. I understand. But here's the deal. I have a vision. God gave me a vision. There's a land that need God. And I beg you, give me 3 days, just 3 more days. After the third day, if we still haven't found land, then we can turn around. And they said, we give you 3 more days, then we're taking over the ship. He said, that's fine. And suddenly, after that conversation, again, these are things you don't read in the history book, a gust of wind caught the sails, and they began to fly across the Atlantic Ocean faster than they had gone up until that point ever. It was they were going so fast that they were really like, why did we make that promise? We are so far now away. Mm-hmm. And on the third day, from the crow's nest, a sailor looks out and he sees a twig, and then they see some birds that were not native to them across the ocean, and then they started seeing other signs of life floating, bark and trees and things like that. And they said, my goodness, there's got to be land. And so on that third day, they discovered, what we call the West Indies. And that was the story behind Columbus discovering what we call the Americas. Mm-hmm. And you don't hear those kind of stories. And that's just Columbus. I mean, I could sit here and go, George Washington. He was, when he was a young man, he was an officer on on a horse, along with the other 40 some officers on a horse. There was a big battle. There was the French Indian War. He was in the battle. The Indians that were fighting against Washington and his army at that time. This is not the Revolution; it's a pre-Revolutionary War.
Yep.
The head chief said, "Shoot the men on the horses. Shoot all the men on the horses, and we will win the battle." They shot every soldier, every officer on the horse and the horses themselves, except Washington. Washington was not killed. He had two horses shot out from underneath him. He got on another horse, kept riding and commanding. All the officers were dead or wounded. No one, he was left giving the command. And finally, when the battle was over, they had won. He took off his jacket. He had four, this is all documented. He had four bullet holes in his jacket. He had a bullet hole in his hat. He had shrapnel in his hair. And then years later, once Washington was president of the United States, a chief came and visited him, and he said, "I wanted to see the great chief of this world." And they said, "What do you mean?" He says, I was the chief in charge of that battle years ago, and we were given instructions, we're going to shoot all the officers, but this one man would not die. And finally, we said to one another, quit shooting at that man. He's a god." And we realized at that point that we were up against something bigger than us. And these are the kind of stories that you don't hear about, you don't read about in history books. George Washington himself would say, along with many founder fathers of our land, he would give credit to the providence of God. He would constantly give credit to the fact that God spared his life and God is steering our country.
So, I mean, I've heard of a lot of those stories. I shouldn't say a lot. Some of those, at least being a product of public school. I definitely heard about the bullets, especially the one in the hat. It was definitely always made a joke. Every year is talked about. But I hadn't heard of the one about the Native American chief afterwards meeting George Washington. That was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people would bring up the argument that America isn't a Christian nation because not all the founders were Christian, or a lot of the founders had slaves at the time. And I get it, like slavery wasn't something being fought at that time. But, it still kind of goes against the whole Christianity idea, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely makes sense. Well, again, we have to understand the context. History always has to be taken in context.
Mm-hmm.
And the context of history at that time was every single nation in the world had slavery. Even the tribal nations of Africa believed in slavery, and it would capture one another. Each other tribe would fight another against a tribe and then make that tribe their slaves. Mm-hmm. Everybody had slaves except Britain at that time had risen up under William Wilberforce and was kicking against that whole paradigm. But yes, there were, but so what I'm saying is it was not uncommon. It was just as normal to have slaves in that day and time as it was to, go to Walmart for us today. It's just, this is what you do. In fact, I believe, hopefully one day, and this is a whole other topic, that one day, our children will look back at us and go, how in the world could you ever allow abortion? That is like the worst atrocity known to mankind, but for us right now, we don't even think twice about it, but it's so wrong. Mm-hmm. But in slavery is in the same boat. But there were many founding fathers that did not believe slavery was good or healthy. In fact, Benjamin Rush, who is considered one of the top three, if you were to ask John Adams, who was one of our early presidents, who were the greatest pivotal constituents of our early founding of our nation, who would the pillars be? He would say it'd be three people. It would be Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Well, we've heard of Benjamin Franklin, we've heard of Thomas Jefferson, of course, but no one hears of Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was an incredible Christian man. He had helped start 5 universities. He was the man in charge of the medical hospitals during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army. He was a personal consultant to George Washington. He was an avid follower of the Lord Jesus Christ, and he would say that any nation founded without the Bible as part and without religion as part of the structure of that nation will probably fail. He was a very avid, and yet I'm saying all this because he also started the first abolitionist movement or society in the early founding of our nation. It would be many people like him that would begin to take that battle cry and say, this is wrong. And, over the course of the next 80 years, finally it would gain enough momentum where we would have a war over it and see the end of that terrible blight of our country. But they were in a process. They were working through it. Again, it wasn't atrocity as we look at it now. And it is. I can't imagine, living in that time and having a slave. That seems so wrong. But at that time, again, in the context, it seemed like, they were just employing people and trying to treat them good. Many people, but then there was that didn't believe that.
I do find the contrast of at least the Civil War, how America fought against itself regarding slavery, and of course people seceding the country and other topics as well. With something else I learned recently, that even the first century church almost completely split on the topic of slavery. When it came down to everyone gathering all the manuscripts at that time, there was large debate on whether slavery was allowed or not allowed. Of course, slavery was, after reading all the manuscripts and coming to decision making, slavery was decided that this is obviously wrong. It goes against, Jesus saying, love one another as you would love yourself. But the fact that even almost split the church in the beginning parallels quite interestingly with America literally splitting in two and having a war over it. I find that parallel kind of interesting there. So moving forward to America today, America Christianity. So, of course, America being labeled a Christian nation, of course, you're going to get a culture of American Christian, It appears today, like, since America, is objectively a good country, it's a very comfortable place to live. I don't know if that's because of where I grew up, where my parents, whatever. Arguably, even some of the worst people off in America have better lives than some of the worst people off in a lot of the rest of the world. Not to belittle their troubles or anything. Of course, anyone going through pain is still pain.
Correct.
But since America's so objectively large, rich, whatever you want to call it, it seems that that kind of complacency of like being comfortable has moved into American Christianity and arguably the church as well. I've had that thought for a while. Now, there's 3, from what I understand, of course, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's 3 main points of the church. One, of course, is to spread the gospel, teaching that Jesus died on a cross, rose back to life to pay for our sins to get into heaven. There's the second one, to teach and build Christians, like discipleship. And then 3 is to show the love of Christ to everyone. So it kind of goes like, of course, spread the gospel, discipleship, and then social work, I guess, is probably the best way to generalize that one. It seems that because we've become so, I guess, complacent as a church, we like to focus more so on the third priority of showing love to the surrounding area, which is not a bad thing. I don't want to say that like a bad thing. but we tend to forget the first and second priority. Is that something only I'm seeing? Because I mean, I know people who would agree with that, but I want to know from another point of view.
Yeah, I would say you're probably right. Well, you look back at Israel. I mean, Israel is a microcosm of what America is, or America is microcosm of what Israel was. It was a nation founded by God supernaturally. Again, I use that. I can't say that enough. America was founded supernaturally. I mean, even going back to the pilgrims coming across on the Mayflower, they wouldn't even get off. They wouldn't get off the boat until they made a compact with God called the Mayflower Compact. A compact with God, a covenant with God that they're going to follow after God. The only reason that America was this, was people started coming was because they wanted to worship God. They wanted to love God with all their heart, mind, and soul. They wanted somebody telling them how they had to love God. And so they were willing to risk their lives. In fact, half of the people that came over on the Mayflower died. They didn't even make it. They just barely survived. But
I think a good parallel to like look at this how dangerous this trip was to today. Imagine a situation where Christianity is looked so far down upon, or religion in general is looked so far down upon. Here comes Elon Musk to the president of the United States. Hey, I need people to go to Mars for me in this spaceship.
right.
I don't know how long it's going to take for this spaceship to get to Mars exactly. It could be quite some time. I don't know if everyone's going to make it, but I heard you have this Christian problem. Let me send them to Mars. That's probably the best parallel I can make for this, what this Mayflower trip is, to go from Europe all the way over to North America.
Man, that's a great analogy. I like that, and there's probably a lot of truth to that. It was a dangerous journey, but their desire to love God freely was paramount to any fear or peril that awaited them. And that's the basis, that's the pillar, that's the foundation of our nation right there. People, the first thing that the communities would set up when they would establish a new community would be the church. And then the whole community would be built around the church. Everything was about God, about the church, about the ability and the opportunity to love God the way you want to love God, with the Judeo-Christian value. And many of our founding fathers, 96% of our founding fathers, some say 98%, all were strong Christian people, not passive Christian, strong Christian people. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, as well as Thomas Jefferson. Many people would say Benjamin Franklin was a deist. I'm not sure. He would go to George Whitfield's revival meetings where George Whitfield would be preaching in Boston, and he would go. There was 20,000 people that lived in Boston proper at that time. George Whitfield, the great revivalist, would show up outdoor meetings, and 22,000 people showed up. And there's more people showing up at those meetings that lived in the city. So Benjamin Franklin was one of them. He loved going to George Whitfield's meetings. And it would be Benjamin Franklin that when they were having the Continental Congress trying to hammer out these laws that we were going to have as a country, and they were at a stalemate, couldn't figure it out, couldn't come to a conclusion, people arguing, keep everybody mad. And the quiet old statesman, Benjamin Franklin, stood up and said, got everyone's attention because he never said anything. He said, perhaps the very fact that our whole nation has been so miraculously founded by the providence of an almighty creator, since that is how we have come to this point, perhaps we should take a moment and adjourn and go to our places of homes and call out to this great providence God and ask for his further wisdom how to move this nation forward. And they said, absolutely, that's what we got to do. They adjourned. They all went back to their homes for 2 weeks, prayed, sought the Lord, came back, and with a matter of weeks, they hammered out what we now call, our Constitution. It was this kind of love for God and drive to see the Lord. And many of the laws that we have, Jonathan, many of the laws that we have come straight from the Bible. They're principles from the Bible. They're precepts from the Bible, and from writings from a guy named John Locke years ago back in England, who a lot of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, a lot of them got their works from, borrowed a lot of his principles from in implementing the Constitution. But going back to your statements, yeah, you know, the three things the church really should be doing, you know, spreading the gospel and building discipleship and then what was the third thing? That was the thing that you were
To show the love of Christ, basically, you know,
yeah
social work.
yeah yeah. Well, that's what the church should do. I mean, all those things is, in fact, you know, when our nation began to build itself up out of the ground, it was the church that carried the country forward. I mean, in every sector of society, you see the church leading the charge. You look in the medical field, most of the hospitals, even to this day, you know, St. Jude's, St. Tom, name whatever saint you want, and there's a hospital with an after. Why? Why was that? Because it was the Christians felt, the church felt like it was their duty to take care of people, spirit, soul, and body, right? And so we led the charge, loving people back into health, and even when Hollywood came along, and it was the church that started saying, "Hey, you know, I think we need to have some kind of a way of letting people know this may not be a really healthy movie to go to." So they came up with the idea of a rating board. And it was the church that was in charge of rating movies in the very beginning. I mean, you name it, the church has led our nation forward in so many ways, and I'm thankful for it. And I really believe, you mentioned that America seems to be very prosperous. And why is America prosperous over other countries? Well, other countries have democracies. How come America's democracies seems to work better than other countries? Well, because in a lot of other countries, democracy doesn't work because there's so much greed, and there's no checks and balances, and you have people in power that are greedy. But however, the Christian faith and the morals that we have in place in America has helped us put people in power or leadership that carry the Judeo-Christian values, and that I think has preserved our nation and made it prosperous. But yet you look, how stop was this? But look back at Israel, and they would prosper, they would flourish, things would go well, and they would forget God. They would forget God, and then God would have to raise up a judge or something, or a plague would come, or an enemy would attack, and then they would cry out to God, and God would come back, and He would hear their prayer, and He would answer, and then there would be another generation, and they'd forget God, and it's a cycle. And it's so important for us as Christian believers to tell our children and our children's children these great stories that I'm telling you about how our nation was founded, because they don't know. They're just being told that America's systemically bad.
Yeah. And I'm going to say that I agree with you with how God made America prosperous, because I do believe that. But I love that you mentioned that the same as the Jewish people, things would be good for a long while, and then they would start to forget. To me, it feels like maybe since probably the past, 40, 50 years, it seems like majority of people are forgetting more and more so. I don't know. I don't think it's a single cause of what has caused it to be. I think it's a multifaceted amount of problems that have just been neglected. And that's maybe why I feel it. I'm not saying your church specifically or other pastor churches I know specifically, but the church as a whole in America feels more complacent about things. Because I don't know if they said tomorrow that we need to send Christians to Mars, like in that illustration I gave tomorrow, I don't know how many people would jump up to say, I'm going to Mars because that's the only way I can freely worship God in that hypothetical situation. I do think that we would want to normally fight it, but if that was the only option, if you're picking up what I'm saying, I don't know how many people would actually jump to that opportunity. So that's where I'm feeling like it's more complacent. And I don't know if that's just because I may be more active online, because we're supposed to go to where the people are. And the people are online for the most part. Of course, there is still interpersonal connections, in-person connection or whatever. But it seems a lot more so that a lot of people are online, and what the representation of Christianity is online, very lacking. It's this kind of gross, actually. But I mean, there's a whole conversation about how social media algorithms, mess all that up as well. But that's for another discussion. The point I'm wanting to get at is with this seemingly complacent church, not saying that it actually is complacent, but it's seemingly complacent. It seems that the first two priorities, the spreading the gospel and teaching Christians, is placed on the back burner in front of showing Christ's love via social work or whatever. Because everyone's saying, you need to do this, church, you need to do this. Because the church has done a lot over America's history, and it's been I would say, a good responsibility of the church to take on the social needs. But we've maybe more so forgotten about the probably more main two priorities of the church: to spread the gospel and teach Christians Christianity, if that makes sense.
Well, I do. It completely makes sense. And I think even the beginning church, the very first church in Jerusalem, they started, it's like, hey, this is pretty good. They settled in, having church services, listening to the apostles' teachings, having fellowship, having prayer, church is growing, they're having a wonderful time. And that's all they're doing. That's all they're just learning and praying and learning and praying. And God's like, this isn't what I had in mind, right? And so God allows persecution to come through Nero, and suddenly, Stephen dies, the first martyr, and people are like, what's going on here? And now they're like gathering together in prayer, and they're praying for courage. That's what they pray. Acts chapter 4, they're praying for courage. God give us courage and boldness, because suddenly the culture that they were in had shifted on them really quick. And they realized that they needed to stand up, and they needed to make a noise. Now, what they didn't realize was that God was allowing this in order to scatter the church, in order to get the church out of Jerusalem and into the world. And the disciples would go all over the world and begin to teach and preach the gospel. And by the third century, according to Philippians, the whole then known world had heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. How did it happen? It happened because people started getting uncomfortable, and they were basically forced out of their comfort zone and into society and into the world. Unfortunately, that's important. I wish that wasn't how it had to happen.
Yeah.
And but we don't learn, do we? We just.
I like that you mentioned the story of Stephen, because I haven't actually thought about that, but it does actually apply quite well today. That if you consider the American Christian to be, or not the American Christian, I would say Christians in America to be Stephen, and correct me if I'm remembering the story wrong, but Stephen was such a good Christian that some of the more elder or more leadership or other Christians, if I'm remembering correctly, stoned Stephen because they made them feel bad about themselves. It's very shortened, but am I repeating that story correctly for the most part?
Absolutely. It was Stephen was the hands of Jesus. Everyone else was that just having Bible studies and writing devotionals. And Stephen was out there taking groceries to the widows. He was taking care of the orphans.
Mm-hmm.
He was literally the hands and feet of Jesus. And the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, Sadducees began to see all the good work. And not only just was it good work, but the Bible says that miracles were taking place as a result of Stephen's work. We don't know what those miracles were. Perhaps he was delivering bags of groceries to an old lady, and she had osteoporosis, and he lays his hands and she's healed, and her spine straightens up, and everything's fine. Mm-hmm. News gets around, and now people are leaving the Sanhedrin, are leaving their religious roots, their Orthodox Jewish religion, and so they had to put an end to it. And so Stephen, not the disciples, not the apostles, but Stephen, the hands and feet, the one that was going out doing it, mm-hmm. was the first martyr.
I do think that story fits very well today. I don't want to call it a story; it was more so historical narrative. But if I think that this is the situation that America's in currently, and I'm not going to call myself a Stephen by any means, but what's the best course of action for Christians today to try to avoid, not necessarily avoid the persecution per se, but try to bring the church out of its complacency to that way they don't need to be persecuted, or persecution won't even need to come?
Right. I no matter what the environment is, mm-hmm. no matter what nation you're in or culture you're in, the bottom line is that we are all, every single one of us, under the command to go into the world and preach the gospel and lay hands on the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the leper. We all have a mandate to take the gospel, which means good news. It's not like God's asking us to go take the bad news. That'd be a hard chore.
Though there are some churches that would only take the bad news. You're going to hell.
But it's good news. Your life can change. There's hope you have purpose. There's a plan for your life. You're not an accident. This is all good news. And yeah. I think what has happened is we forget that other people need it. We have it, and that's fine. And it's not. The majority, unfortunately, of Christians don't even know if their neighbor knows Jesus. Many don't even know their neighbor's name. And so then you have to ask yourself, do you really have the Jesus mm-hmm. that we read about in the Bible, where he says, pick up your cross, follow me, where he says the rich young ruler who has everything and is obeying all the laws and he's a fine young man. I mean, any girl that was single would want to marry this guy. This guy had his act together. And so, but when Jesus asked them the one question, okay, now that you've done all these things, why don't you sell all that you have and follow me? He had an opportunity of a lifetime. He had an opportunity to follow the Messiah, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Redeemer of all mankind. And he passed it off for some bucks. And so I think, we put Jesus and the gospel message like in a pecking order. And unfortunately, Jesus doesn't come first in some of our lives.
If I'm not mistaken, it says in there that he walked away, what is it, sad or depressed, or what's the exact phrasing?
Yep, very sad. It says very sad.
I wonder, because, that story also applies well with at least the state I think America is currently in. And it's probably not 100% accurate, but I feel a lot of I mentioned this in the last podcast, in another podcast that I had with Patrick, actually, that I feel like a lot of America is rich. At least if you look worldwide statistics, Americans on average are the top 1% of the world in terms of financial ability. I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, like if you're making, I believe over 60, don't quote me on it, but I believe if you're making over $60,000 or $80,000 a year, you are in the global top 1%.
Hey, get this. Let me just add to that. But if you took the bottom 20% of the income earners in America, which we would call poverty, right?
Yeah.
If you took the bottom 20% of America and made those 20% a nation of themselves, they would be one of the richest nations in the world.
Yeah. I think we always forget like how good we got it. Like a lack of gratefulness or something. I think it even mentions in, what is it, 2 Timothy 3? I was reading actually earlier today that there's a time going to come where people are, it mentions ungrateful as one of the things, of course, along with other different things, but ungrateful is one of the things it mentions. And I think we forget how good we have it here in America. I'm not saying that America's perfect, that everyone's living painless without any sort of thorn in their side or anything, because of course we all have pain and thorns. It's real life. But comparatively, America's got it really good. Americans have it really good.
The hand of God is no doubt upon our nation, has been for the last 200 years. All you have to do is take a puddle jumper 80 miles into Cuba, and you'll see the results of what happens to a nation that says there is no God. Mm-hmm. You just have to step over into Haiti and see the results of a nation that says we will make Satan our God, which really, that I'm not kidding. That's what they did. Years ago, they devoted their nation, Haiti, to the devil because they're steeped in voodoo. And they said, Satan is our God. Well, it's the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. That's what happens when God's hand is not involved mm-hmm. in the structure of a culture. And because God is so interwoven in our society, or has been up until now, the results are favor and blessing.
Yeah.
You walk away from those principles. Can I just remind us, Jonathan, that the first book that Congress ever published with taxpayer money was the Bible. They wanted to make sure that everybody in America had access to a Bible. Mm-hmm. That was the first book. If our founding fathers were not Christian people, that would have been the last thing they would have done. But they said our people gotta have Bibles. The second thing that they did, we have to have that education. Benjamin Rush was a strong supporter of public education, and we have to have our kids need to learn. And so they called the Gospel Primer, and it was the textbook used up until for 100 some years in all of educational systems in grade schools, ABCs, and every letter was a scripture verse and started with some character of the Bible. A stands for Adam, and then would be a scripture verse underneath it. B, and it goes on. Our whole society, and then when we took the Bible, when we took prayer out of school in 1962, and then we took the Bible the following year out of school in 63, you go look at the statistics of our educational children, and it plummets. It begins to go into decline. Because that's what happens when you take God out of your culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen those statistics. It's quite sad, actually. One point I did want to go back to real quick, though, is I do think when it comes to that story about the rich man who was offered to literally walk with Jesus and follow him, that opportunity is not often. Okay, that he didn't just go asking everyone to, hey, come walk with me and my disciples. I mean, of course, thousands of people followed him, but he didn't personally invite people to become one of them. Not a lot of people. If a lot of Americans fit the shoe of this rich man, and this rich man said he couldn't let go of what he had, I have at least a fear that that's what most of Americans are in that story. We are that rich man. Are we willing to let go of everything that we have?
Yeah.
Not that we have to, but are we willing to if Jesus or God told us to?
Well, it goes back, doesn't it, to the Ten Commandments, and the very first one: have no other gods before you.
Mm-hmm.
And gods don't necessarily mean a piece of stone that looks like some foreign, object sitting on our shelf. It could be money, mammon. It could be relationship. It could be a job. It could be power. It could be authority. It could be a name in the community. It could mean a lot of things. It could be your house, your clothes, your anything that you value more than you value God is a god.
Yeah. I think a lot of people forget. There's probably a lot of things people forget. Mostly probably like you mentioned that since the Bible was taken out of school, there's a lot of basic knowledge of Christianity that just isn't known anymore. Because you could speak some basic Christian idea or culture and it's not like automatically known. I do have a fear though that since we conflate, and this will probably be our last talking point, that we conflate America as a Christian nation and America's current state, which I would argue is a lot less Christian than it was. I don't want to deny the past of what it was. I want to talk about what it is now. Are we, for Christians who aren't as either well-versed or haven't had the opportunity to be well-versed, since a lot of people know America as a Christian nation, do you fear that we marry a lot of American politics, culture, just Americanized things in general with Christianity, where the good and the bad get pulled into Christianity?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's a major thing. That becomes a dilemma that we have to definitely fight against. But here's the encouraging thing. If I could just kind of end with this thought, this idea. The encouraging thing is that in America, we've had two great awakenings so far. Mm-hmm. One led by Jonathan Edwards, another one led by Charles Wesley. And they awakened our nation because our nation, even in the early days, had fallen asleep, if you would, and needed to be awakened. We've had since then the Azusa Street Revival in 1900 in Los Angeles. We had the latter rain movement in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. We had the 1960s, the charismatic movement, and the California, Jesus people movement going, and even through the Catholic Church, sweeping through the Catholic Church as well. We've had these seasons of awakening in our country, and I don't believe God has given up on our country. Mm-hmm. I believe God's eye is upon our nation, and if we will take heed to 2 Chronicles 7:14, it says, "If my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked way, I will, not I might, but I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land." And so no generation is a lost cause. All God needs is, can I just remind us of this fact, that God did not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of the amount of wickedness and compromise in that city. He destroyed it because of the lack of righteousness. Mm-hmm. He was looking for he wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking for the messengers. He only needed a few. He says, "Hey, you can find me 10. Man, we're good. We'll keep rocking along. I just give me 10." But we kind of think that God looks at all the bad that's going on, and then He condemns us all. And I'm saying no. God's not looking at all the bad going on. There's always been bad going on. But God's always trying to find the Gideons, in the wine press, trying to eke out a living, trying to find the Sauls hiding behind the stuff, trying to find the Peters, and on the fishing boat. God's looking for somebody that will just say, God, I know you love us, you love our society, and you love people, and you love me, and you're going to use me. And here I am. God, use me,
Oh yeah, he wants the willing, not the able,
That's
to
right.
carry out his word.
That's right.
That's pretty much all I got. I mean, I feel like there's something else that I'm wanting to talk about, and because there's a lot of what we talked about, how great America was coming up, and how God's hand was in a lot of that, why things were so prosperous, and of course today, that feeling isn't there, that America is as prosperous currently. I mean, you can look at empirical data that other countries are doing empirically better, that aren't necessarily Christian countries. And so I would like to think, like you said, that there is a revival coming. But I guess we're in a blind time or something like that. So this is the last question I'll ask you, how does a Christian in, I guess, either today's time, either help make this revival happen, or how do we not fall astray until that revival?
Yeah. Well, again, I think I'd go right back straight to that scripture I just quoted. If my people humble themselves and pray, repent, everything starts with humility. One of my college professors years ago, I asked him, what's the fast track of knowledge? And he said, be a student of history, because history repeats itself. And if you look at every culture in time, over and over, it's been pride that, seems to, they think somehow that we've done what we've done, that somehow it's been by our sheer intelligence, that we're somehow more intelligent than everybody else in the world, that we've gained the wealth and the prosperity that we've gained. It is nothing more. We enjoy nothing more than the hand of God upon our generation. So we must continue to stay humble and teach humility. And with humility, what comes with humility? And it comes thanksgiving, giving God thanks. You can't be a proud person and be a thankful person at the same time. Pride and thanksgiving are two different things. But when you become thankful, you're humbling yourself and saying, God, I owe it all to you. I'm grateful for what you've done. Thank you. So I think being grateful, being thankful, being a praising, worshiping person is important. Constantly, asking God for a clean heart, pure hands. The Bible says a clean heart and clean hands and a pure heart, God will not despise. And so God can't turn away from a people that are seeking to be holy, clean, and are thankful. God's like, I got your number. I got your back. I'm with you, and I'm going to help you. And that's what God does. He comes in, Jonathan, supernaturally, somehow, some way, and he shows us that he has our back. They're facing the Red Sea thousands of years ago. There's no way out. This is a dead end. We're going to get swallowed up by that which we feared the most. But God makes a way. God always, they have no water in the desert. God makes a way. Water comes out of a rock. They pick up the rock, carry it with them everywhere they go. Wherever they put the rock down, water comes out. And you tell me, how does that happen? God makes a way when he finds the people that put him number one in their life.
That's good stuff. Wanted to thank Pastor J.P. Wilson for coming on the podcast again. I think this was a great, productive conversation. If you do want to learn more about J.P. Wilson or listen to some of his sermons, you can go over to summitchurch.tv to hear him. They are live every Sunday at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. If you did enjoy the podcast, I would please ask that you go ahead and subscribe, as it does help us out a ton, and leave a review. If you want to consider supporting this podcast, please check out the links below. And as always, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.